What you are about to hear is not a podcast. This is a global conversation recorded live in real time with real people.
Journalists,
business leaders,
academics, politicians. I think the terms are deep state. Oh dear.
investors,
Experts, diplomats.
citizens.
Coming together from around the world to share their views and ask our guests the questions. If you would like to join this conversation or hear our incredible library of past conversations, please visit our website, pm101.club, and join the fastest growing conscious community on the free internet. Thanks for being here.
Enjoy.
Enjoy the show. Hey everyone, welcome back to Politics and Media 101. I'm Jeff Browning, and if you listen to our first few episodes, then you know that over the last few months, my friend Justin Higgins and I and our friends have convened hundreds of conversations, sometimes more than once per day, with up to 30,000 live listeners and participants, where we all hear live and direct from people in the news in their own voices, in their own words, in long form, and where anyone who wants to can join to ask them a question, share their thoughts, or just listen. We're just now starting to release recorded portions of our live conversations for the first time, and we're grateful to you for joining us. Today, we're releasing part of a conversation, interview, and audience Q&A we had with Congressman Peter Meijer, a Republican from Michigan. In the early 20-teens, he lived and worked as a conflict analyst in Afghanistan, closely studying what was happening on the ground and trying to help the international community better calibrate and really make its efforts there more effective. Before that, he deployed to Iraq, and all around, since Congressman Meijer was elected, he's brought his experience on the ground to D.C. in powerful ways, using his voice to inform other members on the realities of foreign policy decision-making, what it really means to send Americans overseas and into harm's way, and how we might have been mistaken in the past as we considered and made these decisions. When we talked to Congressman Meijer, he had just gone to Afghanistan on a covert trip with Congressman Seth Moulton, a Democrat from Massachusetts. They both wanted to visit the gates of Hamid Karzai International Airport in Kabul themselves and witness what was happening there. We talked about the Biden administration's decision-making process and much more. We had incredible audience questions, and we hope you enjoy it. As always, if you like or dislike what you hear, if you want to find out how to join us live almost every day of the week, maybe ask one of our upcoming guests a question, or hear past episodes, please visit our website, pm101.live or pm101.club. They both work and will get you to the same place, where you can find all that and more. On the day we spoke with Congressman Meijer, President Biden had just given a speech about Afghanistan, and our first question was about whether he had heard the speech and what his thoughts were. Without any further ado, let's roll the tape.
I haven't heard a statement from you about Biden's speech today, so I want to get your unvarnished opinion. What'd you think, man?
So my unvarnished opinion is I did not catch all of it. So I don't feel super equipped. We've had a pretty busy day here in our district. I'm looking forward to watching the whole thing. From some of the snippets that I saw, I'm a little bit, I've been wary, and I've been wary for a while now, of the tendency to try to take a victory lap, especially when we have much of the mission that has not yet been completed, and we still have a lot of folks that we need to get to safety. I did see a little bit of revisionist history claiming that, the president claiming that we didn't start the evacuations sooner because there was a fear that would precipitate a sense of panic. I think that is a pretty bad faith explanation. You could have been flying out charter planes out of the civilian terminal while there were still flights going to Dubai and Istanbul and Islamabad, and it would not have been controversial. It would not have been crazy. I think Afghans would have understood that this was what we did. Now that we didn't need our interpreters anymore, we're bringing them and their families back. And remember, I mean, there was about an 18,000 person backlog for the special immigrant visas starting, or when the president announced that a final date for the withdrawal back in April. And we had a bipartisan coalition warning in April that we needed to tackle this backlog. If we were for sure pulling up tent stakes, then we have to get these people out. And I think if we would have been addressing that, if the president would have addressed that when we were warning about it back in April or in in May. I mean, if you started 500 people a day May 1st, we probably would have tackled 2/3 or more of the numbers, and then it would have been a lot more simple to evacuate folks, and you wouldn't have seen the crushes at the gates, the tens of thousands of people desperately trying to get in. So that's my quick take reaction from
Thank
the
you for
parts
that.
of
I'm
the
going to
speech
go
that I
a
saw.
step further on what you were just speaking about. Over the last 7 months, so from when he got into office to now, he to before the withdrawal at the end started, which was in August, there had been, I want to say, fewer than 2,000 of our Afghan partners evacuated from the country. So what do you think of the withdrawal on the whole when you have experts coming on our show, like Dr. Seth Jones from CSIS, saying that maybe there's 100 to 200,000 people that could be on kill lists that helped Americans survive and our coalition partners, and the SIV program doesn't even work for people that helped our CIA and intelligence agencies maneuver around the country. So with that in mind, how would you characterize Biden's withdrawal?
So one thing to note, I mean, and let me first give a tremendous kudos to our airmen. I have forsworn any jokes at the Air Force's expense because of the incredible work those C-17 pilots did, and seeing what the Marines and soldiers, just the dynamic they had to contend with on the ground. I think we should all be incredibly proud of the work that our men and women did on the ground, not just uniformed personnel, but also our State Department diplomats who were on Hamid Karzai International Airport, HKIA. One thing to note, when the president says 122,000, that was not solely on U.S. aircraft. That they included our NATO allies and others who flew people out. It was still a remarkable achievement, but it's important to know that that's not a one-to-one for either U.S. resettlement or U.S. responsibility for the direct flight. Now, of course, we were manning those gates, although the British were controlling a gate for a time at Barron Hotel, and there were some other, slightly different factors there. But we had some groups. If you look at the target groups we're talking about, the 18,000 special immigrant visas, and we just raised, Congressman Crow and I introduced a bill to raise that another 10,000 from the current cap of 18,000, which essentially addresses our backlog, but trying to route some of the individuals who were in highly adjacent categories. Maybe they didn't work for the U.S. military as an interpreter. Maybe they were working for, a U.S. Contractor or a U.S. organization that was putting them at similar risk, just so we can have a bit more streamlined rather than relying on the P1, P2, or humanitarian parole categories. But I mean, there are some large groups in here, and for each individual SIV applicant, you're talking about 3 to 3.5 dependents, a spouse, and then the immediate children. So it gets a little bit more complicated. But some of these groups, like the locally employed embassy staff, that was a number in the thousands. And then we had the final remnants of our Afghan National Security Force that were providing our force protection at the airport, without whom our forces would not have been able to get out. We had to bring their families over. We had to bring them over. So when it comes to the actual SIV category, we still have a lot of ground to make up because, again, those 122,000 are not 122,000 people coming to the U.S. or even 122,000 evacuated by the U.S. Just were part of the airlift at the airport in that 16-day period.
Yes. So just for the audience, you went with another friend of the show, Congressman Seth Moulton, and took an unauthorized trip to HKA, the airport in Kabul, to kind of see what was going on the ground there. And I'm wondering, how much were you kind of just shepherded around by administration officials, and how much did you actually get to go and walk around independently?
So, we had initially planned a completely independent kind of itinerary and support network on the ground. When we were on the ground, it became, our first goal was to just announce ourselves for the awareness of the military and diplomatic leadership there. obviously we wanted to keep this very quiet, very quick, very light footprint. And so we kept the circle of individuals who knew ahead of time to, I think, probably less than a dozen, because we know how quickly word can spread in Washington, and we didn't want to be accused of raising the threat profile at the base. Now, mind you, earlier that day, the director of the CIA was on the base, and that was made public while we were there. So I think he was slightly higher profile than we were. But we had planned for kind of civilian, like one of the groups that was on the ground to kind of drive us to some of the gates so we could get an understanding of that. One of the generals, very insisted that we go with a member of his security detail in a car that was only used when he was moving from one location to another, and he had no movement scheduled for the rest of the day. So those individuals did not have otherwise an assignment, and so that was one of the reasons why we accepted.
So I want to get into a little bit of your drawing some of your military experience to help me understand. I'm not in a military. I've worked as a legislative assistant on the Hill, but who was in charge of drawing up the plans for this withdrawal and like the civilian military divide? Is it Jake Sullivan of the NSA? Does the Secretary of Defense actually have any role in creating these plans, or is it more General McKenzie? Like, how high up for the tactical and strategic withdrawal plans actually?
So our understanding is that this was essentially a State Department mission. Again, I don't have. I think we're still waiting to figure out kind of the tick-tock of events and conclusions. But per most SOPs, an NEO, a non-military evacuation operation, is typically in the domain of the State Department, and I think that's our understanding in terms of who was leading the effort. And frankly, I think that was one of the problems. The State Department is well equipped to do that in maybe a disaster context or some other drawdown, but given how this was essentially the conclusion of a military mission and one that fell in on our military resources, the fact that DOD was in the back seat and state was driving it, I think contributed to a lot of chaos, to a lot of crossed wires and miscommunications. We were seeing conflicting guidance. I think that frankly contributed to a lot of the chaos and a lot of the confusion. And in this, if we could go back, I think we should have prioritized the military's role in the evacuation, because the Department of Defense and our military are far better equipped to deal with a rapidly evolving situation, especially from a security standpoint, than the State Department is. The State Department is largely a reactive entity. They are not well equipped to deal with emergent scenarios, and I think we saw that play out to a T.
So considering that you've also said that anybody who was in charge of kind of planning this withdrawal, if they had any honor, they would resign, and you haven't mentioned any names, and considering that Anthony Blinken, Secretary of State, is really, really close with President Biden, so you'd have to assume that he was driving the fact that state should be in the driver's seat. Do you think that Secretary of State Blinken should resign?
I believe my direct quote was that those who are responsible for the failures that we witnessed should, if they have honor, will do the right thing and resign. So I am in the position right now of having the firm belief that when we are in the midst of a chaotic situation, when the emergency is still ongoing, the last thing you want to do is add disruption onto disruption. But that having been said, we will, once we get some stability here and have the ability to hold, or once we get stability and can move to the point of accountability, that'll be something that we will be looking at closely, is who ignored what signs and when, and how do we make sure that those who are responsible are held to it.
Congressman, I was reading an article about you. You didn't necessarily attribute the Trump Republicans' opposition to resettling these refugees to outright xenophobia. It was something more like just maybe a lack of understanding of the refugee resettlement process, that they're interpreters. So I kind of want to ask you a question and read you something from Congressman Scott Perry, what he said today.
I saw his remarks. So
how do we square that?
And obviously my comments were before seeing his comments. I think it's incredibly unfortunate that we are seeing, this issue, which again, I mean, we've had a lot of very positive, bipartisan support because folks understand, the moral and frankly national strategic imperative at play. I think it is again beyond unfortunate that it is getting to that point. I mean, that's not going to change in any way, shape, or form, how we act, and I hope it doesn't change the opinions of the body of a whole. It's no surprise that there are some very polarizing individuals who hold beliefs that are outside of majorities. Some people will seek opportunities to. I'm probably just going to stop talking because I'm going to say some things that are less than kind, and I think you understand my sentiment.
I do, and I'm glad that you saw the quote, folks. I'm not going to read it. It's really actually disgusting. So the congressman definitely does not agree, and I do want to add in that the Republican governor of Utah sent a beautiful message, lending support to the Biden administration about resettling refugees in Utah. Republicans in Utah already step up, do whatever they can do to help out. So it's not necessarily just a partisan issue here. So Congressman, my last question to you before we kind of kick it over to our friends in the audience who have questions for you is we've had you on, we've had Congressman Moulton on, we've had Congressman Auchincloss on, who was on last night for the third time. And it seems like you're all taking a very measured approach, not to be too critical in the middle of a, ongoing crisis. I gave you a layup here to criticize the Biden administration. You kind of passed on it. So I was surprised. But how would you say, how would you, now that you're a veteran, you're in Congress, how would you say that veterans approach this issue versus the other members who aren't veterans? Is there a similarity? Is there a difference? What are you seeing?
I would say that, especially on the veteran front, I mean, it's far more, frankly, personal. When it comes to Afghan interpreters, this is not some abstract, pity these poor random individuals. I mean, these are folks that we're talking to on WhatsApp, that we're Facebook friends with, that FaceTime us, that we got to know very well. Especially, and this was not my experience in Afghanistan because I was there as an aid worker, but for many of the infantry folks who were there, the interpreters were the guys who had been with unit after unit after unit, were essentially the institutional knowledge of that mission, and were the guys, getting folks out of really dicey situations, and it's very, very key. I mean, they were part of that team. Now, my work in Afghanistan was with an NGO, so it's slightly different in terms of that. But I mean, these were still the people who kept me safe, and that I worked side by side with. So I think that's a perspective that, ironically, is shared by many journalists. And I think this is one of the reasons why you see so much journalism, so much media criticism of Biden over this, because he can't really spin it. I mean, Biden saying, or Jen Psaki or Ned Price are saying one thing, John Kirby saying one thing, and then you have these talking to their fixers, talking to their drivers, and they're like, what the hell are you talking about? No, I was stopped at that checkpoint. No, the Taliban did beat these people that I saw. So I mean, it's a very different understanding where you cannot spin away this reality. So we're
on that note, folks, we're going to the audience questions, the awesome part of the night. We will go to Aneep first. Aneep, do you have a question for the congressman?
Yeah, thank you, Justin. Yeah, thank you, Congressman, for joining us. I wanted to get a sense of, I'd like to hear kind of some criticism of how the operation went, and if you were in charge, what you would have done.
Well, thank you. I think to me, the number one thing that was the error that, from my vantage, I couldn't see, but those who had better intelligence products or more timely intelligence products definitely would have, which is the degree of local and regional co-option of the Afghan government and Afghan national security forces by the Taliban shadow government. So in the way the Taliban is structured, they have shadow governors, they have shadow provincial governors, they have shadow district governors, they kind of have shadow mayors. Essentially similar to the way the British government operates. So those, as the U.S. withdrawal was ongoing and kind of steaming towards August 31st, a lot of those more local and regional level Afghan officials started cutting their own deals, their own accommodations, their own understandings for when that day came. And a lot of the negotiated settlement and the power sharing agreement was predicated on there being an Afghan government that would then blend with the Taliban government, probably a bit more defederalized, probably some more autonomy and power at the provincial level. But what ended up happening is, because of the immediate and rapid dissolution of the Afghan government and security forces, there was no final leverage. There was no government left to blend in and have there be power sharing, because all the power had already been lost. So I think what should have happened was that if we had our operating assumption insofar as how we were proceeding along, all of those we forgot some of those operating assumptions, namely the strength and legitimacy of the Afghan government. As that eroded and disappeared, we should have slowed the withdrawal. We should have assured the Afghan national security forces and the Afghan government that this was not an unconditional withdrawal, but one that was working towards that power sharing agreement. And I think that would have given a bit more support and precluded that rapid dissolution.
Thank you for that question, Aneep. We will go Kidus and then
Thanks. So my question is about so my understanding of the trip that you and the other congressmen took to Afghanistan was to look at the situation on the ground and to be able to consider convincing the Biden administration to extend the evacuation deadline. And upon seeing the situation on the ground personally, you concluded that the existing deadline and the decision of the administration was the best available option. So, but my question is, why did you feel that you could not trust the conclusions of the State Department, the Department of Defense, and the intelligence that you were receiving from people on the ground, and that you had to go yourself? Did you feel like you could not trust it, or what was the reason?
No, I mean, that was exactly the reason. We had a series of briefings, just in the past, and then maybe the 10 days prior to us leaving. But we had a series of briefings going back to April, and many of which, especially the classified briefings, I had, you get a little bit more information out of a classified briefing than an unclassified briefing. But I always found the best information came when I had a chance to go and chat one-on-one, establish my kind of understanding of bona fides, and then kind of get the very specific answers. The understanding I got from those conversations was light years away from the information that we were getting from the administration as the situation was unraveling. And then we were being given information in these briefings that, they were unable to confirm or said they couldn't confirm on an open line. Simple things like where President Ghani was, the day the palace fell. This was widely reported on Tolo, on social media, and local and international media. I'll be very honest. I felt that they didn't fully understand the situation. That by the time information got to them, it was already highly outdated or irrelevant in some of the ways that they were presenting the information that was given. You could only assume was being done in a deceptive fashion. especially when it came to trying to get people through the gates, trying to understand that evacuation procedure. We had networks on the ground that were the only way we knew, the only reason why we knew what was going on, because one person knows this Marine, another person has this soldier who's there, somebody else is talking to that diplomat. The official channels were quite literally, we were given an email inbox to send things to. It was a one-way communication, and oh, by the way, that inbox was consistently getting jammed and overflowing and bouncing back messages. So when I say that the information sharing was wholly inadequate, it was really just pathetic.
I have a follow-up to that, Congressman. You mentioned that you didn't raise the security threat profile and that 2 off-duty people took you around. When you see people on CNN like Phil Mudd just losing their mind and criticizing you for how reckless it is, what do you think?
I really walk away with a renewed a newfound appreciation for the just kind of establishment Democrat. And when I say that, I mean, this is sort of President Biden has his and Nancy Pelosi has hers, and they were very much intertwined, like this narrative network. And I guess I had also not fully appreciated that Congressman Moulton, having run against Nancy Pelosi, challenging her for speaker, and also challenging Joe Biden for president, meant that he was not necessarily their favorite either. But I mean, let me put it this way. I mean, the Biden administration leaked to the Washington Post that we were there while we were on the ground, and we had to change our flight schedule so that the word didn't get out while we were there. I mean, we're just desperately pleading, like, please, like, let us get off the ground before you kind of hit publish on this. So I was just really astounded by the bad faith there. And I think Phil Mudd is in the same camp of Joy Reid. I mean, you just kind of have these people who are, they're surrogates, right? I mean, this is their role that they fill. And that's not to say that all of the criticism was in bad faith. I certainly understand, those who have some criticism, but, I certainly, well, frankly, I think the administration was quite embarrassed that they didn't fully understand how we got there. It doesn't exactly give a ringing endorsement to, the competency of your evacuation if folks are able to come in and you have no idea until they kind of walk up and announce themselves. So I think that it was a very, it hit them on an emotional level because a lot of the things that came out were, just dead wrong. But again, the lie gets around halfway around the world. Well, the facts are still putting their shoes on. And it also didn't help that we were kind of stuck in the Middle East. That we were in a very low data, low information environment. Low data, like literally my phone had low data and it was really hard to make calls because the cell networks in Kabul were jammed. And we were also touring. We were on flights for most of the time and touring the Aliyah Salim in Kuwait and the Al Udeid in Qatar, kind of lily pad processing centers for refugees. So we were not in a position where we could actively combat a lot of the spin and vitriol coming our way. Whereas, the folks who were sitting in air-conditioned offices in DC could really spin up their messaging networks in a much more rapid and fluid context.
That is absolutely awful that they leaked your location when you were in the airport. I did not know that. That is very, very bad and serious stuff. We are going to go to Andy, and then after Andy, I will go to Ned.
Thank you, Justin. Thank you so much for joining us today, Congressman. Just wondering if I could ask you whether you think the view held by some is justified that perhaps Europe and the US's allies feel a little ignored, that the White House and President Biden made a decision and implemented it without consulting the US's allies. Many thanks.
Oh, that's absolutely the case. I talked to a number of European ambassadors, especially NATO ambassadors, after President Biden made his announcement, and I was shocked that there had been no coordination. And again, understandably, some of these NATO countries had withdrawn their forces and they didn't have troops on the ground, but that didn't mean they didn't have personnel on the ground. The war in Afghanistan is still the only time that the NATO Charter, Article 5 in the NATO Charter of the Self-Defense Provision has been invoked. We lost 2,400 U.S. service members in this conflict, but our NATO allies also lost over 1,100. So there's been a lot of sacrifice on behalf of our NATO and other partners in this fight. I thought it was deeply shameful the way that President Biden messaged that at the beginning. And, we can get into his comments that our global standing was not hurt, but I have yet to talk to a single ambassador who will not tell me just outrageous frustration and anger at feeling that the U.S. just kind of left them behind, did not pay them heed. I had talked to ambassadors under the Trump administration before I got into office who were far more reserved in their criticism of President Trump than some of these ambassadors are being about their criticism of President Biden, which I find really telling.
Thank you for that, Congressman. We are going to go to Ned.
Hi, Congressman. Thanks for being with us. My question is, what role, if any, do you think that defense contractors and other corporate interests played in the prolonging of this conflict? And how much of a risk does the military-industrial complex going forward play in potentially getting us into future boondoggles and other things that maybe aren't aligned with what the American public would want?
I don't think they play as much of a risk as many people fear. They make a lot more money off of the F-35 and like nuclear weapons programs and building big battleships and new, weapons platforms. The F-35s, the F-22s had a pretty marginal role in this conflict. And even the foreign military sales to the Afghan military, pale in comparison to other forces throughout the region. I think a larger contributing factor was just, frankly, Congress's taking its hands off this whole mission. I think that prolonged it. I think it was much more inertia and just, post 9/11 momentum and then very few arresting forces than it was an industry or companies trying to push it along. It just had its own legs.
Thank you for that question, Ned. We will go to fellow redhead, my moderating partner here, John Gunnison, for a question.
Yes, thank you, Justin. And of course, very important in the introduction. The congressman is carrying on a proud tradition of service going back to George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Alexander Hamilton of redheads in the United States. But my question, Congressman, is about U.S. force projection internationally. The withdrawal and evacuation from Afghanistan is happening in the context of a large conversation about U.S. presence overseas. I think that we're all very familiar with the contours of the conversation around the U.S. presence in the Republic of Korea, Germany, and Japan. But maybe an area where there's a little bit less of a consensus is about the U.S. presence in a part of the world that's very dear to my heart, which is the Arabian Gulf. The U.S. is, of course, a fundamental critical security partner of the UAE, of Qatar, of the KSA, and other countries in the GCC and the broader Arabic-speaking world. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on the status of U.S. presence in the Arab world, whether it's something that you expect will continue, whether it's something that you think adds great value to U.S. security, and in general, your thoughts about this element of U.S. foreign policy.
Yeah, I will say there were a few folks who were happier to see us when we were touring throughout the region than some of our GCC allies. And that to me was, it was very telling that they looked at the U.S. withdrawal and were horrified at the way in which this became really a rallying cry for extreme Islamist groups throughout the region. All of these countries have, their concerns about kind of the threat to concerns about stability, about their internal stability, about the regional stability. And then here we go. Now, Afghanistan is not super in their region. There's it's across the Gulf, and But it's still the way in which the Taliban's swift and decisive victory over the Afghan government and U.S. forces becomes that rallying cry for other extremist groups is incredibly troubling to them. So I think, not by design, but this is drawing us closer to those allies, both in our dependence upon them, specifically with the Emiratis and the Qataris, to get people out. So we're getting dependent, while at the same time they very much want us to maintain our presence for their own internal security moving forward. So that's maybe a silver lining, but again, not one born out of positive or good circumstances.
We will go to Sarah next for a question. Sarah, over to you.
Hi, Congressman. Thank you so much for being here. My question is about WhatsApp and the Taliban using US-based servers and US technology to conduct their operations and basically, convince people within so that they could, quickly take over without a fight. Is there a reason that, people aren't talking about this more, or is there not anything that we, even, in the US government can do to put pressure on these private companies to monitor these types of operations better? I think that, that these users haven't been banned, at least that's my limited understanding. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yeah, just one thing from the outset. So the Taliban is not technically a foreign terrorist organization, as the State Department, or as per the State Department's guidelines. There's what's called an FTO list, and they are not on it. Now the Haqqani network is, and there are some individuals associated with the Taliban that are individually listed, special SDGs, specially designated groups and individuals on those terrorist lists. But the Taliban as a whole is not. But to your broader point, we saw that in the early stages after the Taliban took over the country, WhatsApp had been disabling and suspending some group chats. Now, some of those some of these chats have been used by the Taliban to disseminate propaganda and to disseminate threats and other information. Other channels had been channels that folks in the U.S., as part of this massive civilian mobilization, were using to communicate with people on the ground who needed to be rescued. So there was a very severe content moderation dilemma where the way in which they were approaching it, far from helping protect people and kind of blunt that propaganda effort, was cutting off some of the lifelines that were needed to rescue folks. It's obviously, I'm by no means an expert on WhatsApp kind of group chats and how those, kind of are disseminated. I think there's obviously an intelligence value, and to the extent that U.S. agencies might be able to see or intercept or understand that, there's an intelligence value in getting that. I think there's a very sincere concern on behalf of the U.S. that if cell phone service goes down in Afghanistan, our understanding goes pretty dark. Then we're limited to, just what we can see from the air, and that becomes very problematic and very troublesome for our understanding of what's going on and for our ability to communicate with folks on the ground. So I tend to be of the opinion that there are certainly downsides, but that it's hard to treat that with a scalpel, and that there are even upsides to that being those type of electronic communications going out. And I guess I'll leave it at that. I don't want to get too far out of my depth in terms of U.S. based companies versus non-U.S. based companies, but obviously there's a sort of moral and a PR angle which was being played upon when they did those initial cuts that had that negative impact on Afghans who were trying to communicate with rescuers on the outside. From a legal standpoint, because the Taliban aren't on the FTO list, I don't believe that are any sort of specific programs.
Thank you for that question, Sarah. We're going to do two more, and the last question will be from somebody from Grand Rapids. But on that note, then we're going to go to the congressman for his last thoughts. On that note, I want to go to Marshall, our favorite Republican from Texas, and then we'll go to Amit. Marshall, over to you.
Thank you very much, Justin. I appreciate that. And Congressman, thank you so much for being with us for, if I'm recalling correctly, the second time. My question had a lot to do with the Republican Party's views of SIVs. I had, at least in the Texas Party, there'd been this sort of narrative that if we delayed, if we were quick in pulling out the SIVs, that we were going to collapse Kabul. I personally never found much convincing in that argument or that particular question. I was curious if you found or had heard some inter-party spats that might have made pulling the SIVs out harder.
Absolutely not. I mean, if you look at the legislation, sorry, not to shoot that down, but if you look at the legislation that we passed to support SIVs, the Allies Act, so the funding appropriation, in sort of June and July, and some earlier bills that passed on the suspension calendar. I mean, I think we got more votes for to raise the cap for Afghan SIVs than we had to award congressional gold medals to the Capitol Police for January 6th. Like that, this was not partisan. I mean, you had, I think there were maybe a dozen Republicans who voted against it, but again, out of 435 members of Congress, I mean, this was 95% plus were affirming and supportive of this. I mean, I had heard, in some from some folks that the administration was worried about, for the same reason that President Biden was initially hesitant to raise the refugee cap, despite it being a campaign promise, because he was hesitant of that being conflated with the failure to control the southern border and the large numbers of individuals coming across there. To me, the hypocrisy there is that, comparing refugees and what are largely economic migrants, though there are some asylum seekers with potentially valid claims in that mix, is the difference between somebody who's going through an approved process and somebody who isn't. I mean, in the SIV case, and not just that they're going through an approved process, I mean, these are folks who had put their lives on the line to support the U.S. mission. So, I mean, if President Biden is letting his policy get dictated by what he fears Tucker Carlson might say, I would expect him to operate completely different in the large number of other ways. But again, to me, those excuses and attempts to backward explain and backward justify inaction over a course of months, when again there was strong bipartisan support, it rings really hollow.
I'm glad to know the gospel was wrong. Thank you so much, Congressman.
Thank you for that, Marshall. His brother works for Ted Cruz on the Hill. We are going to go to Amit for our last question. We try and do it with class, so we try and get you a constituent congressman. Here you go, Amit.
Hey, Justin, thanks so much. And also to John and Peter for putting all of this together. And Congressman, good to see you. So I finished high school in the area of Rockford around the same time as you, so a little bit of overlap there. Although I'm not a constituent anymore, I do think you're better suited to represent the district than the last guy. That's neither here nor there. But look, my question, same one that I asked Congressman Claus last night, around the future of Afghanistan and the Taliban as a potentially conducting diplomacy with them. And the question was around basically, is that possible? What does that look like? Are we comfortable with that? And Congressman Auchincloss basically outlined a few conditions under what sounded like he'd be willing to do that. And I'm curious what your take is on it for the future of U.S. diplomatic relations in Afghanistan. Are we going to take steps that actually legitimize the Taliban or not?
Yeah, well, thank you, Amit, and that's awesome. Yeah, Rockford, we had a lot of cross-country matches against you guys. I think, again, I come at it not from a strict binary standpoint, but as somebody who, as a conflict analyst in Afghanistan, very much was not operating in a black and white, these people are good, these people are evil. compared to maybe the upper crust kind of Kabuli international class, the Taliban were, downright medieval. There was a brutality that inherent to a militant group. Although, obviously the Taliban, has ties to Al Qaeda, and some of those ties are enduring, especially through members of the Haqqani network. The Taliban as an organization have not exhibited transnational, violence aims. Again, that could change, and even when we say the Taliban, we say that as if it's an incredibly cohesive, command and control structure, when that is not the case. I mean, it has an organizational hierarchy, but it's not like a professional military force, with good order and discipline. There is, there's sort of professional Taliban, and then it kind of gets a little bit militia-y. And some of those folks who are members of ISIS-K started off with the Taliban. I'm sure there are probably people who started off with ISIS-K and went over and joined the Taliban. I mean, it's a very murky picture when you get down to the ground level. That having been said, in our reports, we did not call the Taliban insurgents because in their view, they were the legitimate government that was dethroned by an outside, international backed, government that did not have internal legitimacy. Looking at how rapidly that government fell, it's hard to argue on that legitimacy front. The Taliban themselves, are going to be faced with the hard choice of how they will govern, to what extent they will, adjust their, pre-2001 cultural expectations to reflect the current reality. We've seen some. Well, let me just put it this way. I mean, Afghans are super pragmatic. We've seen some really interesting kind of extensions of olive branches from the Taliban. I think one of the Haqqanis paid tribute to Ahmed Shah Massoud, and calling him a hero and a martyr and a hero of Afghanistan. And Massoud was the Northern Alliance guy, right? I mean, yes, he had fought against the Soviets, but he had also fought viciously against the Taliban from Panjshir. He was viewed as such a threat, that on September 10th, 2001, Osama bin Laden, Al Qaeda had him assassinated by two Al Qaeda members posing as Tunisian journalists, anticipating that after 9/11, the U.S. would invade or there would be consequences, and they wanted to weaken, the assumed heir apparent to be the leader of the new government. So, the fact that one of the Haqqanis is paying tribute to him was pretty wild. The Hazaras, which are ethnic, kind of sectarian / ethnic group, they're the largest, the dominant Shia minority group in the country. The vast majority of the Pashtuns, the Taliban, are overwhelmingly Sunni, as are the Tajiks and the Uzbeks. It's a little, again, murky, but that group had been historically, brutalized and targeted by the Taliban and also by ISIS-K in similar ways that ISIS in the Levant had gone after Iraqi Shias. One of the Hazara warlords came to an accommodation and kind of turned over and joined the Taliban. Right? So now they had done similar things during the Civil War. There were a lot of these kind of olive branches or sort of peace offerings. They don't always hold up, of course, but even the fact that Ismail Khan down in Herat, I mean, again, this guy, famed Mujahideen fighter against the Soviets, just also famed fighter against the Taliban. The Taliban captured him and then, didn't seem to have treated him terribly. And there were a lot of Afghans who were watching every single video and every single photo of how they were treating Ismail Khan and trying to figure out what this would mean. They didn't execute him. It doesn't seem like they beat him. And he, quote unquote, escaped to Iran, which I take as code word for he didn't really want to join, but they basically let him leave. So there's been a lot of those really kind of interesting accommodations. We've heard of districts where, Taliban came in and said no girls are going to school, and then the tribal elders come up and say we'd actually like our girls to go to school, and they go, okay, you can let your girls go to school. Now, how much of this is early days kind of PR and image rehabilitation, and how much of this reflects a commitment on an ongoing basis to be more pluralistic? It's impossible to say right now. I think we absolutely have to prepare for the worst case scenario, which is, either the Taliban, to uphold their own legitimacy internal to their mission, go very, very extreme and very brutal. There's also the possibility, which I think would lead to worse outcomes, of Taliban infighting that might precipitate a civil war, as we saw in the 90s. And there also is a scenario where the Taliban, and frankly, if they're smart, I think they'll try to pursue this. The Taliban realized that without firing too many shots in the month of August, they just took control of the entire country, and it makes sense for them to find the most sustainable course of action to maybe have a different set of expectations and standards in Kabul, than they have in Ghazni, and to come to something where the outside world maybe isn't thrilled with them, but they're not the pariah state that gets turned away. It's funny, it's darkly funny at times when they'll be outraged that they cut the hands off of a thief, and they're like, "What are you talking about? Like Saudi Arabia does this?" And it's like, So there are ways in which I think they could blend what they're doing with something that, while not getting U.S. or international, like the international community is not going to be overwhelmed. If they provide stability, if violence ebbs, and it's just and there are some basic, women are not forbidden from going to school or going to work, but maybe there are just some more culturally conservative components. There could be an understanding that's reached. Again, so much is going to depend on the treatment of former members of the Afghan National Security Forces, and obviously we've seen plenty of reports of reprisal killings. There was a video that was floating around that purported to be the Taliban hanging someone from a Black Hawk helicopter, and then other videos came up where it was actually a guy they were trying to put a flag on a building, and he's hanging from a strap. So there's been a lot of allegations of atrocities, some of which are certainly accurate, some of which are wildly overstated or inaccurate. It's really hard to understand what direction things are going to go in. But if the Qataris and the Turks help to reopen the airport, if American citizens and SIV and folks who work for the U.S. government are unmolested and allowed to depart if they so choose, I think a lot of the apprehension and anxiety within Afghanistan could dissipate pretty rapidly. The Taliban have been interviewed by some female journalists within the country. But then there's also female journalists who've been turned away. So again, it's just a really uncertain period right now. But and I don't know what internal legitimacy battles they have to fight too. So it's going to be very unique. But the U.S. and the Taliban have cooperated to target ISIS-K for a couple of years now, and I don't know how much to believe it, but President Trump's last, acting Secretary of Defense, Chris Miller, said that one of the components that was kind of a quiet negotiation was that the U.S. would keep Bagram, and it would be for joint counterterrorism operations for groups that were fighting both the U.S. and the Taliban. In some ways, that's crazy. In other ways, it's not that crazy. But I hope we have plans in case it's non-terrible, while at the same time having our expectation be that things could devolve quickly, and to not get over our skis again and be caught flat-footed the way we were caught flat-footed in August.
What a thoughtful, great answer there, Congressman. So you've been so liberal with your time, very generous. Thank you very much. I just wanted to kick it over to you for last thoughts, how you want the people that are with us to come away from this conversation with. It could be about the war, could be about the withdrawal, it could be anything, could be optimistic, pessimistic, somewhere in between. What do you want to leave us with tonight?
Well, I think, I guess I'll leave everyone just to say have healthy skepticism about anything you see getting rapidly shared or retweeted. We're getting information out of Afghanistan right now is really hard. And there's a lot of preconceptions that, again, may very well come to fruition. But this is it's going to be a very volatile period in the coming days and weeks. I think what I've been saying is that the next 20 years of Afghanistan are going to be determined by the next 20 days. And to me, the lesson we should be taking away from this is that we need to have a full, now that this, at least our troops on the ground component is complete, we need to have a full and unsparing, I said a 9/11 style commission on the conduct of the entire conflict, on how our national security, defense and intelligence communities got so much so wrong that after 20 years, with the exception of the equipment on the ground, and maybe some buildings that were built, not much remains of, trillions of dollars of investment and thousands of lives. So I think it's incumbent that we don't just move past this point, but we ensure we learn every lesson we can and not just learn it, but apply it so we don't repeat the mistakes that were made. And just really appreciate the time that everyone spent here and for having me on.
Well, that just about concludes what we have for you today. But as always, if you like or dislike what you hear, if you want to find information about how to join us every day of the week, maybe ask one of our upcoming guests a question, or hear past episodes, please visit our website, pm101.club or pm101.live. They both work and will get you to the same place where you can find all that and more. This has been Politics and Media 101. Again, huge thanks to Congressman Meijer for coming out. I'm Jeff Browning. On behalf of Justin Higgins, our co-founder, and our team, thank you very much for being here. We hope to see and hear from you soon.